With the end of the Cold War and the financial situation, suddenly the military were starved. Of course, that included the Navy. The Navy suddenly found they could not keep ships in commission, could not keep...
Most people think nuclear submarines are safe once they sink. They assume the deep ocean freezes everything in time. That is a lie. Scientists recently lowered a remote-controlled vehicle to the wreck of the K-278. What they saw on the screen made their blood run cold. A vent on the side of the sub was puffing out a strange cloud. When they tested the water, the numbers were off the charts. This discovery forces us to look at every other wreck in the ocean differently. The time bomb has officially started ticking. The leak that changes history. The official story says an electrical short in the 7th compartment sparked the blaze. But here's the deal. Not everyone buys that story. You see, the Komsomolets was on a mission to break records. It was pushing the limits, diving deeper and running faster than any boat before it. And this is where the wild theories start. One theory says the fire was not an accident at all. Some experts whisper that the sub was testing a new, highly experimental weapon, maybe a torpedo with a bizarre new fuel, something unstable, a fuel that ignited when it shouldn't have. Others believe the sub didn't just catch fire, it was hunted. They point to the fact that this was the height of the Cold War. A top-secret titanium sub all alone in the deep was the perfect target. The theory goes that a US or British hunter sub was trailing it, got too close, and the two machines collided in the dark. The impact sparked the fire that doomed the ship. Whatever the cause, the result was a total nightmare. Electrical systems failed. The tanks that helped the ship float wouldn't work. The crew fought the fire for 6 hours in brutal conditions. They surfaced, but the fire was too intense. The sub, a symbol of Soviet power, slipped beneath the waves and plunged more than a mile, almost 5,500 feet to the ocean floor. It was a tragedy, and for 30 years, that's all it was, a sad story and a memorial. But here's the catch. The Komsomolets was not just a sub, it was a nuclear weapon carrier. Down in that wreck, sitting in the dark, is a 190-megawatt nuclear reactor. And that's not even the worst part. The crazy part is it's also carrying 2 nuclear-tipped torpedoes. These torpedoes are not like the ones in the movies. They don't just have uranium. They have something far worse, plutonium. Each one is packed with about 28 pounds of it. Plutonium is one of the most toxic substances known to man. A single speck of it, if you breathe it in, is enough to end your life. And now there are pounds of it sitting on the seafloor. For years, scientists said, it's fine. The water is too deep. The water is too cold. They said the plutonium is stable, but not everyone was convinced. The Norwegians, whose coastline is right there, were worried. So, in 2019, a joint mission did something new. They sent a state-of-the-art remote-controlled robot down to the wreck. They were going to record what was really going on. The first footage was haunting. The titanium skin, which was supposed to be rust-proof, was covered in damage. But then the robot got close to a ventilation pipe, a small opening in the side of the sub. What they saw made their blood run cold. A strange, cloudy plume was puffing out of the pipe, like smoke from a chimney. The sensors went wild. This is the recording that changes everything. They were not just seeing it, they were measuring it. They took samples. And when they got those samples back to the lab, the numbers were unbelievable. The radiation levels inside that plume were up to 1 million times higher than the normal seawater. Let that sink in. Not double, not 100 times, 1 million times. The main culprit is a nasty element called cesium-137. This is the same stuff that poisoned the ground around Chernobyl. It gets into the water. It gets into the plankton. The plankton are eaten by small fish. The small fish are eaten by big fish, and the big fish end up on dinner plates. What most people do not realize is that this discovery is a game changer. It proves the wreck is not stable. The plutonium in the torpedoes is breaking down. The salt water is eating away at the wreck, and the poison is getting out. The puffs of radiation were happening because of the ocean currents washing the poison out of the wreck in pulses. And this leads to another wild theory. Some people whisper about a mythical Cold War substance called red mercury. It was supposedly a secret material used in triggers for nuclear devices. Many experts say it was a hoax, a fake story to trick spies, but others are not so sure. What if the torpedoes had a new experimental trigger? What if red mercury was real? And it is this unknown material that is reacting with the salt water in such a violent way. It would explain why the leak is so potent. So here's the deal. The Komsomolets is a ticking bomb. The scientists on the mission were stunned. They said they had never seen levels this high coming from a wreck. It proves the out-of-sight, out-of-mind approach is a total failure. The wreck is a generator of radioactive pollution, and it has been silently pumping it into one of the most important fishing grounds in the world. The question was no longer if it would leak, but how fast. The next recording reveals something even worse than a leak. Towed to destruction in a storm, the Komsomolets is a disaster, but at least it was an accident. The sub was lost in a heroic fight. But what about the other wrecks, the ones that were not accidents? You see, what they recorded from the Komsomolets was a wake-up call. It made scientists look again at all the other pieces of Soviet nuclear junk littering the Arctic. And what they found was in some ways even worse. Welcome to the Barents and Karus. This is the frozen backyard of the Soviet Northern Fleet. During the Cold War, they treated this place like a garbage dump, a nuclear garbage dump. According to official reports, the Soviets intentionally sunk 19 ships loaded with radioactive waste. But that's not all. They also dumped 17,000 containers of radioactive waste. And get this, 16 nuclear reactors. 16! Many of them still full of used nuclear fuel. They just dropped them in the ocean. The most famous of these is not a submarine, but it is from one. It's the reactor from the K-27. This was an early experimental sub. Its reactor was a total failure. It was cooled by liquid metal, not water, and it was constantly breaking down. In 1968, it had a terrible accident.
Leaked radiation and sickened the crew. The Soviets tried to fix it for 10 years, but could not. So in 1982, what did they do? They just towed the whole submarine out to a spot that was only 100 feet deep and sank it on purpose with its 800 pounds of highly enriched uranium fuel still inside. But why? The official story is it was too expensive and dangerous to take apart. But the wild theory is much darker. That liquid metal reactor was not just a failure, it was a monster. It was so unstable, so unpredictable, that the crew had nicknamed it the Golden Fish, a sarcastic name for something that would cost them everything. The theory goes that the Soviets realized they had not just built a bad reactor, they had built a bomb, a system so volatile that any attempt to take it apart on land could trigger a massive explosion. Sinking it in the shallow, isolated Karos Sea was the only way they could be sure to bury their mistake, hiding it from their own people and from the West. For decades, this too was ignored, but the new data from the deep made everyone panic about the K-27. If the deep wrecks are leaking, what is happening to the K-27 in shallow water where storms can hit it? Scientists believe the reactor is ready to go off. They say a nuclear chain reaction could start up again underwater, triggering a massive explosion of steam and radiation. It would be a true underwater Chernobyl. But the story of this Arctic graveyard gets even darker. Fast forward to 2003. The Cold War is long over. Russia is trying to clean up its act, partly with American money. They have a whole fleet of old, rusting, dangerous subs from the 60s. One of them is the K-159. It has been retired for 14 years, just rusting at a dock. Its reactors are shut down, but they are still full of spent nuclear fuel, about 800 kilograms of it. That is nearly a ton of the most dangerous stuff on Earth. The plan was to tow the K-159 to a shipyard to be taken apart. But in a move that still baffles experts, they decided to tow this 70-year-old hulk across the Barents Sea in the middle of a storm, and they towed it using old pontoons that were barely floating. It was a recipe for disaster. The storm hit, the pontoons broke loose, the submarine started taking on water. In the middle of the night, the submarine, with its crew of 10 men, sank. It went down in over 800 feet of water. 9 of the men did not make it. This seems like a story of pure criminal neglect, and it is. But there's a wilder theory, a more cynical one. What if the sinking was not an accident? Think about it. Russia was being paid by international partners to dismantle these old subs. But what if the cost of actually taking apart the K-159 was more than the money they were getting? What if the sub was so leaky, so irradiated that the shipbreakers refused to touch it? The theory is that the sinking was an intentional accident, a convenient way to make a billion-dollar problem disappear. They get to keep the cleanup money, and the submarine is now at the bottom of the ocean, where it's too expensive to recover. It's a dark, cold, and terrible idea, but it would explain how such a stupid plan, towing a wreck in a storm, was ever approved. So, here's the deal. The recordings from the Arctic are not just from one sub. They are a whole library of disasters. You have the Komsomolets actively leaking plutonium. You have the K-27 intentionally sunk and threatening to explode. And you have the K-159, a toxic wreck created by pure modern-day neglect. What most people do not realize is that these 3 wrecks alone contain more long-lived radioactivity than all the radioactive waste ever dumped in the ocean by all other countries combined. And that is just the Arctic. The problem on the other side of the world in the Pacific is on a whole different scale. But wait until you see what is happening near the city. A slow leak into the harbor. It is not that simple, though. The threat in the Pacific is not deep. It is wide. This is where hundreds of subs go to rust. If the Arctic is home to a few very dangerous wrecks, the Pacific is home to a fleet of them. We are talking about Vladivostok, Russia's main port on the Pacific Ocean. On the quiet coastlines near this city, the water looks ordinary, but just below the surface lies something that was never meant to linger this long. Locals call it the submarine cemetery. This is not a single wreck. This is a mothball line, a place where the Soviet Union sent its old decommissioned submarines to wait for their turn to be scrapped. But here's the catch. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and the money for scrapping these subs, it just vanished. So for more than 30 years, this ghost fleet has been sitting there. We're talking about dozens of hulks. Some reports say over 100 submarines were left here. They are clustered in shallow bays, tied to old piers, or just half sunk in the mud.
Satellite images show a truly post-apocalyptic scene. You see rusted-out metal skims, towers sticking out of the water at strange angles, and decks covered in weeds. What most people do not realize is that these are not empty, harmless tubes of steel. Many of these submarines were nuclear-powered, and the process to shut them down was a total mess. The challenge is huge. Safely shutting down a nuclear sub means removing the fuel from the reactor. This is a complex, dangerous, and expensive job. You have to handle the radioactive fuel rods, put them in safe containers, and store them. But in the chaos of the 90s, this process just stopped. So many of these wrecks, rusting away in shallow water, still have their nuclear reactors inside. Some may even still contain spent nuclear fuel. They're just sitting there, corroding in salt water, right next to a city of over 600,000 people. And this is where the mystery deepens. The recordings here are not just satellite photos. They are whispers of a new threat. A wild theory is floating around. What if these subs are not just being ignored? What if they are being scavenged? Think about it, an unguarded graveyard of nuclear technology. The theory is that rogue states or even terror groups are using this ghost fleet as a parts shop, sending in small secret dive teams in the dead of night. They wouldn't be stealing the whole reactor, but what about the components? The special pumps, the shielding, the control systems? Or worse, what if they are practicing, learning how to take apart a nuclear reactor, using these wrecks as their training ground before they go after a live one?
It is a terrifying thought. These wrecks are not just a toxic dump. They are a potential university for nuclear terrorists. And get this, the danger is not theoretical. This exact area has a history. In August 1985, at a shipyard in Chajma Bay, right near Vladivostok, a routine refueling operation went horribly wrong. They were working on a nuclear submarine. Technicians made a mistake. A chain of failures led to a sudden, uncontrolled nuclear chain reaction inside the reactor. The result was a massive thermal explosion. The blast was so powerful it blew the 20-ton reactor lid straight up into the air. A column of radioactive material shot thousands of feet into the sky. The explosion instantly ended the lives of 10 sailors. Dozens more were severely injured. A fire raged for hours, spreading more contamination. A radioactive plume drifted over the land and water. The shipyard, the docks, and the surrounding hills were all poisoned. For years, the Soviets kept it a secret. It was one of the worst nuclear accidents in naval history. A small Chernobyl that most of the world never heard about. The official story was a violation of safety procedures. But the wild theory says it was not just an accident. It was an experiment. The theory goes that the reactor on that sub was being intentionally stress-tested. The engineers were pushing it on purpose to see how much power they could squeeze out of it. They were treating a live nuclear reactor like a race car engine, and it blew up in their faces. The 10 men who were lost were not just victims of an accident. They were victims of a reckless, secret experiment. So here's the deal. The submarine cemetery of Vladivostok is sitting right on top of a known contamination zone. The recordings here are from the sailors who survived Chajma Bay, from the locals who whisper about the ghost fleet, and from the satellite photos that prove the wrecks are still there. The problem is the backlog. Russia simply inherited too many submarines and had no money to clean them up. And while all of this was about the environment, there was one Soviet wreck where the recordings had nothing to do with radiation and everything to do with spies. The Glomar Explorer deception. This story is different. It is not about radiation leaking out. It is about spies trying to get in. The recording in this chapter is the actual video, film, and secrets the CIA pulled from a Soviet wreck. And it's one of the wildest, most expensive secret operations in history. The year was 1968. The Cold War was at its peak. A Soviet Gulf II class submarine, the K-129, was on patrol in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. This sub was carrying 3 nuclear-armed ballistic missiles. And then one day, it just vanished. It stopped checking in. The Soviets searched for it, but the Pacific is a big place. They couldn't find it. It was gone. But here's the catch. The Americans found it. The U.S. Navy had a network of underwater listening posts. They heard a strange sound, an implosion, and they figured out roughly where the sub went down. They sent one of their own subs, the USS Halibut, to find it. And it did. The K-129 was sitting on the ocean floor 3 miles down. That's 16,000 feet. So here's the deal. A Soviet nuclear sub, complete with missiles, codebooks, and encryption machines, was sitting on the seabed. It was an intelligence gold mine.
The problem was it was 3 miles down. You cannot just send a diver. No machine on Earth could lift something that heavy from that depth. So the CIA did what the CIA does. They built one. They launched Project Azorian. And they needed a cover story, a big one. So they went to the most famous and weirdest billionaire in the world, Howard Hughes. The story was that Hughes was going to mine the ocean floor for manganese nodules. It was a crazy futuristic idea. They built a massive 600-foot ship called the Hughes Glomar Explorer. It had a giant pool in the middle and a massive skyscraper-sized claw designed to be lowered to the ocean floor. The press and the Soviets bought it. Everyone thought Hughes was just being eccentric again. But the Glomar Explorer was not for mining. It was a high-tech recovery vessel. In 1974, 6 years after the sub sank, the ship sailed to the wreck site. They lowered the giant claw, a thing they called Clementine, down for 3 miles. They found the wreck. They locked onto the sub, and they started to lift. What most people do not realize is it almost worked. The official story is that they got the sub halfway up, but then the old damaged metal skin could not take the stress. The claw failed. About 2/3 of the submarine broke off and fell back to the ocean floor. But the CIA did get a 40-foot section of the bow. And what was inside? This is where the recordings come in. The CIA filmed everything. They recovered the bodies of 6 Soviet sailors whom they later buried at sea with full military honors, a video they later gave to the Russians. But they also got their hands on 2 nuclear-tipped torpedoes. They got sonar equipment. They got technical manuals. The one thing they didn't get was the prize, the missiles and the code room, which were in the section that broke off. That is the official story. Now for the wild theories. Theory number 1. The "it broke apart" story is a lie. It is the second cover story. The real story, the theory goes, is that the Glomar recovered the entire submarine, or at least the entire section they wanted, the part with the missiles in the code room. What did they find? Something so big, so secret, that they had to pretend the mission was a failure. Maybe proof the sub's missiles were aimed at China, not the US. Or maybe they found something that was not Soviet. Theory number 2. This one is a mind-bender. What if the K-129 was not on a normal patrol? What if it was a rogue sub? Some researchers have pieced together a wild story. The sub was secretly taken over by a rogue faction of the KGB. Their plan was to sail to Hawaii and launch a nuclear missile at Pearl Harbor. They wanted to start World War III and frame it on China. The sub sank before they could do it. If this is true, what the CIA really recovered was not just a sub, it was proof of a plot that almost ended the world. Theory number 3. This is the darkest one. The K-129 did not sink because of an accident. It was sunk by an American submarine. The theory points to the USS Swordfish. The story goes that the Swordfish was shadowing the Soviet sub. There was an accident, a collision, or maybe even a deliberate torpedo launch. The K-129 was destroyed. Project Azorian, in this theory, was not an intelligence mission. It was a cover-up.
The CIA had to get to the wreck 3 miles down to recover their own torpedo. So, what do you think? Are these wrecks just tragic history, or are they an active threat that we are ignoring until it is too late? Which theory about the K-129 do you believe? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories they don't want you to know.